Okay, so we have a new episode of Legends and Leaders, and today it's great to have Curt Jones here, the inventor, the founder of Dippin' Dots. You're now trying many different new categories with a similar process with 40 Below, and I'm excited to see what you're doing with that. So let's get into it. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. So, what did you aspire to do with your life when you were young? Did you always want to be in science and into ice cream? How did this kind of all start?
I've always had a curious mind. I grew up on a farm, and my grandfather was actually quite entrepreneurial. Along with farming, um, he also made brooms, which I thought was kind of interesting. He grew his own broom corn, had his own broom making equipment, and I
Huh.
actually got to help him when I was as young as 5 or 6 years old, put labels on broom handles. So uh, just always kind of grew up around that, always trying to figure out a way to make a little extra money on the side, whether it was baling straw or hauling hay or whatever it might be. So always around that kind of environment, I think.
hmm And how did like the more like the cryogenics side of things, like the science side, like how did that kind of occur? Because you seem to have more of the experience on the hands-on side.
Well, as I grew up, when I went to college, I got my bachelor's and my master's degree in microbiology, and I always liked the industrial side, like using microorganisms to make something, whether it was fermenting, corn into alcohol for fuel or whatever it might be. So the way I got into cryogenics is I went to work for um, I guess you could describe it. It was a biotechnology center, but they actually made high tech animal feeds. And one of the
Huh.
products they were working on when I came to work for them was they wanted to put probiotics back into animal feeds. Probiotics are just natural alternatives to antibiotics, and they typically would use something like a yogurt bacteria to get inside the animal to make the gut healthier, avoid using antibiotics. So I was in charge of that, making the bacteria, growing them, freeze drying them. And I wanted to do it in a quicker way than what they were doing it because I wanted a smaller ice crystal. So I started playing with liquid nitrogen. And I found that if you could freeze the bacterial cultures into little beads or pellets, that you could freeze it faster, get smaller ice crystals, you could have better surface area for freeze drying, etc. And of course, that worked really well for what we were doing. And then I was making homemade ice cream one day on a Sunday afternoon and thought, well, why don't I make ice cream like this? Because you want the same things. You want small ice crystals and so on and so forth. So that's kind of how I got off into the Dippin' Dots business.
And Kurt, so you kind of launched the company out of your family's garage. Like, what did they think of you at the time? Were they supportive?
Oh yes, I was. My wife and I had been married for a few years at that time, and we had a my daughter Tracy was about 4.5 years old at the time, and we were living in Lexington, Kentucky, in a duplex actually at the time. And I started bringing home like liquid nitrogen tanks to experiment with in the kitchen, things like that. So they were always supportive of it and having fun with it. We would show it to our neighbors and get their reactions, and some thought I was crazy, some kind of were intrigued by it. So just kind of had to kind of navigate through all
Mhm.
that. But
And what was the reaction from people when they tasted Dippin' Dots? Like, right the ones you froze initially, like, did they just absolutely love it and you're like, oh my gosh, we have a hit here? Like, what do they kind of think?
well, I think their expectations were so low when they saw it in beads that actually their eyes and their face would light up because it tasted so good. I think scientifically it's one of the best ways to make ice cream because the ice crystal formation is really 40 to 50 times smaller than in regular ice cream. But I think once they tasted it, that was the key: getting it in their mouth, getting them to taste it, and then we got really good positive comments and a lot of support. The thing with Dippin' Dots, as with many products, is it had a lot of word of mouth in the beginning because people would tell other people about it. So
Right. And did people realize that like right away the advantages of like beaded ice cream that maybe it was just, the advantages compared to traditional, like it was just less, maybe less brain freezes, et cetera. Like were people kind of noticing that or was it more just the appeal of like this, hey, this is a new way to have ice cream?
I think in the beginning it was just a new, novel way to experience something that they already loved, and but over time I think they did appreciate the quality of the product. And you're right. We got a lot of early reports saying, "Hey, this doesn't give me brain freeze," and there's scientific reasons as to why that happens that way. But no, I mean, I think in the beginning it was mostly just, "Wow, this is really unique and interesting and different." Oh, and by the way, it tastes really good. So.
Right, that's another added benefit for sure. So, so the ice cream itself, like, how did you start to get it out there? Did you just start, word of mouth, and you were doing all the packaging and shipping yourself? Like, did you start working with a company? What were like the first steps to really make this into a business?
Well, that was one of the problems because we found out at a pretty early stage that you have to keep this product at a colder temperature than most ice cream companies are used to. So we really had to do almost everything ourselves. Not to compare anything I did with like a Thomas Edison or anything like that, but when he perfected the light bulb, he had to basically create the infrastructure because there were not lamp sockets, there were not back then there wasn't even really electricity. So he had to develop a whole system, and we kind of had to do a similar thing on a much smaller scale with Dippin' Dots because we had to figure out how to get it from one place to the other and still keep it at 40 below zero. We had to find out ways to display it, package it, so on and so forth. So we had basically opened a store um, and kind of developed a lot of our early recipes and got to experience, giving a sample to a customer, selling them a cup of product, and then got to develop the logos and packaging over time, which eventually got us into, theme parks and other locations.
Mhm. And where did the name Dippin' Dots come from? Like, who created that name?
Well, actually, that's an interesting story because we had been working with Beat It Ice Cream for several months, but we still didn't have a name that we really loved. We had probably 4 pages of names that we had written down and just couldn't find one. I wanted something that was kind of descriptive of the product, but also fun. So we went from Lexington, Kentucky, back home to our little small town of Grand Chain, Illinois, for Christmas in 1987. And I told my wife and daughter on the way home, I said we should have a little potluck slash ice cream supper. Of course, in the middle of the winter, you don't typically have ice cream socials, but I said let's do that, and we'll make some product and give it out to everyone, and we'll just ask people to write down the first name that comes to mind. And out of about probably 50 or 60 people that came, um, one lady named Vonda Jones, no relation to us, although her husband worked for us for many years, and I had already known him. Uh, we actually went to college together. But anyway, she had written down the name Dip and Dot, like two different characters, if you will. But when people were reading out the names at the end of the night, I heard dipping. In my mind, I heard it as dipping without a G. And so I thought, oh,
Huh.
that's interesting because you're dipping the dots being the beads. And so I just knew when I heard it that was kind of what I wanted to go with. Now it's interesting. Later on, several years later, we were doing business with Japan, and the company there wanted to call it something different because they were being very specific that dot was a two-dimensional, not a three-dimensional structure, and we finally just,
Mhm.
well, my wife really put her foot down and said, no, they got to call it Dippin' Dots or they just can't handle it. So we kept it Dippin' Dots. But,
Why do you think you guys had so much success in Japan as like for a foreign country? I mean, it seemed like Japan just really caught on to this right away. Like, what do you think were some of the reasons there?
well, I think I think they were just, maybe they were used to, seeing technology changes, and I don't know, just found it unique. I mean, probably, I'm not sure if it's a Japanese thing or just, a lot of countries we went into, people just found it interesting and unique because they'd never seen ice cream like that before.
Hmm. And how did you ideate the flavors? Like, what flavors do you want to have initially? Like, was that just trial and error? Like, what kind of went into that?
Well, I mean, my favorite flavor is a vanilla, which, a lot of people like vanilla, but I like vanilla mixed with other things. So I think just a vanilla, chocolate, strawberry was the original ideas, and then just kind of add to that. But also at the time, yogurt was very popular because we had companies like, I Can't Believe It's Yogurt, and some other very popular TCBY at that time. The country's best yogurt, I guess, was what that stood for. But we had a lot of yogurt flavors in the early days of Dippin' Dots. But when we got into theme parks, we found out that people weren't necessarily looking for a more healthy product that particular day of the year. So we really kind of gravitated back, to ice cream flavors. And then it's funny, we had a flavor called Neapolitan, which is a mixture of vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. But we also had a banana flavor, and the banana flavor on its own didn't sell as well. So we were running low on the Neapolitan, and we started adding banana to it. One of our employees, a lady by the name of Marilyn Phillips, she actually was working for us at the time, and she added some banana to it and called it Banana Split. And it ended up being one of our best sellers, for several years. So a lot of our flavors just kind of developed that way. I mean, we certainly had some other flavors, like mint chocolate was a flavor that we had back then, and we had just a lot of different. We had caramel and different things like that we experimented with as well.
How much, Kurt, would you say that Oprah's show did for when you guys appeared on her show did for the brand? Like, did it just really attract so many new customers, or were there other specific publicity experiences that helped take you guys to a different level? Like, what effect did that really have?
Well, when we were first asked to come on the Oprah show, it's interesting. This was back in 2004, and we had really not launched an online store yet at that time, but we had been talking about doing that. So we knew we had just a few days or weeks to really, try to kind of get that in place. But we didn't have at that time, we didn't have just a ton of locations where you could actually go and get the product, because we were still a pretty small company. So I think what Oprah did for us more than anything, it's not like it really spiked our sales immediately, but it really helped us with brand recognition, because I think at the time, each of her shows, every time it would air, it would reach 20 million viewers, and I think it aired 4 different times. So it did a lot to really get our brand well known out there.
hmm And when you were trying to expand to retail, I mean, how difficult was it, when you were trying to expand initially, and like, how did the approach for the stadiums and the amusement parks kind of come about? Like, why steer that direction?
Well, when we first had our store open, we knew that the public liked it on a small scale. So in other words, even though we didn't have a lot of customers come into our store because of where we were located and because it was a new brand, the people that did come in, we had a very good idea that people liked it and they would come back. We get repeat customers. So my sister Connie, who lived in Illinois at the time, she wanted to get involved, as well as my parents, who lived in Illinois. And we eventually moved kind of back. Well, we ended up in Paducah, Kentucky, which is right across the river from where we grew up. But in the meantime, in those early days, we started calling around to some different theme parks and things. And Connie actually reached Opryland theme park in Nashville, Tennessee, which is no longer there, but it was a really nice, popular park, music-based park, similar in size to the Six Flags. And it's kind of a funny story, because she'll tell you that everything she said was the wrong thing to say. Like, they would ask her, like, how big of a company you've got. Oh, we're very small. We work out of a garage, just one thing after the other. But eventually they said, well, we'd really like to see your product. So we got an appointment with them, and we went down and showed it to them. And eventually we got into there, the next season. And it actually failed for the first couple of seasons because, nobody knew what the product was. But the third season, we actually got to come in and actually run the kiosks ourselves, the locations ourselves. And that's when we really learned how to sell an amusement park, and learned all the amusement park lingo that you have to know, like to get into other parks. So it was kind of a learning process, but at the end of the day, it was very much worth it, because once we got into several theme parks, then we got momentum, because not only were we selling a lot of product, but we were just getting that continued brand awareness, and it started kind of moving around the country at that point.
hmm And was it similar with baseball stadiums as well? Like a similar approach?
Yeah, same thing. I mean, you get into one to begin with. It's kind of like you crawl before you walk in almost everything you do. So, you get into the first baseball stadium, you get a little momentum going, and then you end up going to a lot of these trade shows that are specific to a certain market. And once you have one or two successes, it becomes a lot easier to get into other locations because they kind of see it as a a profit maker, a profit center for them as well.
Sure. And Kurt, you guys were awarded at Six Flags. The You were awarded, I believe, the best vendor of the year like multiple times. Like, what do you think enabled you to go from just starting off and barely even getting into a theme park to becoming the best one for them multiple years in a row?
Well, I think when the product really caught on, it one term that we learned in theme parks was a term called per cap, and that means that it's basically the average that you will spend um, on a product. And in other words, it's the total number of guests, you know, and then, for example, if it's Coca-Cola or cotton candy or whatever it is, if there's if you sell $1,000 and there's 10,000 guests in the park, then you've done a 10-cent per cap, for example. And so I think for us, our per caps kept increasing every year, and so all of a sudden we were one of the top per cap, snack items in the park. And I think that really made a difference on us being able to, to go into other parks is just by getting that per cap number up, where it's a very profit um,
Mhm.
center for the park.
And how important has the like? Do you kind of have this other side of the business that's focusing on like contract freezing for microbiological products, et cetera? Like, how much of like was that even comparable to like the ice cream sales revenue, and like how much of a focus even is that?
Um, well, I mean, it was certainly some of the early machines that we sold into other industries were very important to us from a cash flow standpoint at that time. Um, but I mean, over time, I mean, the real focus is, it's how much ice cream can you sell. I mean, it's the beaded ice cream, that trying to grow a brand. That was what we were most interested in.
Yeah. And when the acquisition by there was I think one acquisition, and then J&J Snack Foods, took essentially bought the company. Like, what did you think of those acquisitions? Like, do you think they overall helped Dippin' Dots, and the J&J one currently is like, what are your thoughts on them?
It's kind of hard for me to comment on that. I did. I mean, certainly, I think it's good. I think J&J is a they're a large public company. They've got plenty of capital to continue to expand the brand. Um, you know, the folks that they acquired it from. I mean, I worked with them for a little while, and then I left the company, of course, and so I was kind of out on a lot of things over the last several years. But I guess my main comment is that I think J&J uh, is a good acquisition. I think it's good for their portfolio of brands, and I think for Dippin' Dots, like I said, it's a company that's got the capital to continue to expand it, which I think is going to always be good. We like to see the brand continue to expand since it's something that we founded and started.
Yeah.
So
hmm And what are your plans now with 40 Below? I mean, you have a coffee product, you're working on like a fitness product. There's a bunch of different ones. It seems like you're taking the similar freezing method and kind of applying it to avenues that may not have been as explored previously. What is your goal to kind of target these avenues and find new product market fit? Like, what do you hope to achieve with 40 Below?
well, I think having created the category, I've always been a big believer that, and with my microbiology background, I've always been a big believer that flash freezing is just one of the best ways that you can preserve, the freshness and taste of something. So I think what we're trying to do is take individual markets and create a product for that market. So 40 Below Joe is, I mean, it's a real high quality espresso based coffee that's frozen into beads. It can be brought back to life. You can add water, microwave it, steam it, have a great cup of coffee. But you can also uh, mix it with little beads of non-dairy creamers, for example, that are flavored with salted caramel or hazelnut, and so you can have this edible coffee product. And I think when you go off into the fruit markets, um, or the other markets, like for example Island Rocks, we make margaritas and pina coladas and strawberry daiquiris, and they're all made with all natural fruit. So it's kind of a nice way to, and you can add liquor to these if you want to do like a real margarita, for example. And one of the more interesting products that we're working with right now is called the Fruity Way, Um, as you know, whey is left over from like cheese production or yogurt production, and it's really got all the dissolved minerals and vitamins and protein from what I call the milk water. So we add real fruit to this, so we can have a low protein version, if you will. It could be a fun product for kids, that's got real fruit in it. But we can also add protein powder to that to get into a different market that's got, for example, weightlifters could use it, or even in nursing homes, for example, it could be somewhat of a meal replacement because of the high protein that's in it, and it's a fun way to. It's a different product, instead of opening up a can or package of Ensure, you're actually eating like a real cool, um, fruit-based product, for example.
Mhm. Do you think that with Cup of Joe, in a sense, like with the coffee, that is there like is there like a change in the way, or is there more of an appeal in the taste because it's these frozen beads that are unfrozen if you want to make it like a traditional coffee? Do you think it changes the flavor? Like, are there other benefits to it as well?
No, actually, what it does, it actually locks in the freshness of the espresso. Um,
Hmm.
and that was one of my, well, in fact, the way that I got into doing this is we actually had some Dippin' Dot stores that we had opened in Nashville many years ago, and I'd always wanted to put coffee in the stores. And so I started going around to some of the different coffee shops around town and talking to the baristas. And the one thing they would always say is that you want to make all of your cappuccinos and lattes, all your products from a very um, fresh espresso shot. In other words, you want to run the espresso, put your beans through the process, and then grab it and make your product. And the reason is because of the oxygen in the air. It can start oxidizing certain compounds in the coffee that give it a taste that's not as fresh. So my thinking was, well, I immediately thought, well, what would happen if I froze it at 320 below zero? Would that lock in that flavor and freshness? And I found that it
Right.
did. And I did this not just on my own, but I worked with um, I'd been working with a coffee company to try to select the best beans, for putting in the store. And I had them go through the process with me to where we could actually make products from, flash frozen beads of coffee. And they said, hey, this is incredible. It's still, all the freshness is still there. And we found that you could also keep these beads for weeks or months even, and you would still get that same freshness when they came back alive. So
Yeah, I mean, to me, it sounds like this is like has great potential, this product. I mean, even if you also went and licensed it to like Starbucks, like their proprietary coffee, let's say, or Dunkin' Donuts, and said, hey, we have a fresher way for you guys to do this, that could also be an interesting avenue to go.
no doubt, no, I think the coffee has unlimited potential, and the coffee market is so hot right now. I mean, as far as no pun intended, but
Yeah.
it's just a growing market, and I think a lot of our brands have their own interesting stories that will occur, but I think coffee is one that could really grow. So
Yeah. I mean, also when you're mentioning like the kid snack, I mean, there's a lot of opportunity there too because parents want like the kids to like Dippin' Dots, but it's not necessarily the healthiest product. And if you have more of a healthier like version of that with the same type of fun and appeal of the way Dippin' Dots is made, that could be very exciting.
well, yeah, and another product that we're in the process of launching will be something very similar to ice cream. It'll just be kind of our non-dairy version because when we developed the coffee beads, we also developed a line of non-dairy creamers made from coconut milk, almond milk. You can also use oat milk and things like that. But we found that some at some festivals and things that we would do, um, sometimes if the kids were there and the parents wanted coffee, we'd say, well, we can just give them the creamer. We'd give them like a mocha, which is basically like a chocolate creamer, and they really liked it. So we started going down the road of kind of developing some products that are, uh, might create a whole new brand that would be very similar to eating Dippin' Dots, for example. So it would have
Right.
not have coffee in it, but it might be a cookies and cream that would be a non-dairy version.
Have you
So
explored like more of a restaurant approach for what you're doing now? Because there's a lot of different products you're mentioning. Like you got the coffee, you have like the snacks. I mean, these could kind of turn into more frozen food type or experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to eventually do something like that where we had are you talking about like a 40 below store type of thing that would,
Yeah, but like more like restaurant oriented, where you can come in and like have now you have this frozen stuff, but it's frozen in a much better way, and it retains the freshness, and you heat it up there, and it could be something like that.
yeah,
Yeah,
no doubt. No, that's something we'd like to put out at some point. We'll, find the right location and put in this kind of 40 below shop of beads, whatever we end up calling it, but you could have a lot of
yeah,
different things that you could make. So,
for sure. Yeah, well, I think that's all the questions I have here, Kurt. I appreciate you coming on and sharing your story. I think it's an incredible story, and what you've built has affected the lives of many people. Excited to see what you continue to do with 40 Below, and yeah, I mean, appreciate you coming on.
all right. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.